people, and then sometimes we meet them. But I do want to say what an amazing experience it is to be able to work with Maxine Waters. She's a national treasure, and before she became chair, she was in the minority party, and for a very long time, she kept talking and warning us about the excesses of Wall Street. And had we all listened to her last decade, I'm not sure that this recession that Wall Street caused would have happened. I'm so glad that our colleagues elected her as chair of financial services. She's going to do an amazing job and look out for all Americans. So we should give her a big round of applause. And also recognize her husband, Sydney, and all that you do for public service and having been an ambassador. So thank you for your service to the nation as well. And sitting next to Maxine is the love of my life, my wife, Betty. And as some of you may know, she was recently elected to the Torrance School Board. And I want to recognize the Torrance City Mayor, Pat Fury, and his wife, Terry, for their leadership of Torrance, as well as other Torrance council members. And to my friend Leroy and his staff for all you do for Torrance. I see Superintendent George Mannon of the Torrance Unified School District. Thank you for being here. And want to recognize Don Lee on the Torrance School Board, and you have the very best school board in the nation, just being objective about that. And thank you, Donna, for your leadership of the Torrance Chamber, and John for your leadership as well. So I'm going to touch on 3 issues. The first will be on what is happening locally. Then I'm going to talk to you about what is happening in Washington, D.C., and then I'm going to conclude on Yemen, because very few people ever talk about Yemen. So in terms of what's happening locally, the first is infrastructure. I was pleased to have worked with Councilwoman Waters and other members on a bipartisan basis to make sure we got full Phase 1 funding for Metro. We'll continue to make sure we give Metro the funding that they need to build out light rail and subways in Los Angeles, Southern California. And we're working with Metro to make sure that we take the Green Line all the way down here to Torrance. And in addition, we were able to stop Metro from putting in a sort of stupid plan that was going to make it hard for South Bay folks to access the Metro and require more than one stop. So we were able to make sure that that didn't happen. In terms of other infrastructure, last term I introduced a bill that would provide $2 trillion of infrastructure funding across America. If you look at the American Society for Civil Engineers report, they say we have a $4 trillion infrastructure deficit. But when I introduced that legislation, even some of my colleagues in my caucus said, oh, that's too expensive. You might have remembered last year when the president gave a State of the Union, he talked about infrastructure, and then he mentioned the figure 1.5 trillion. So I said, see, I wasn't that far off. So I think there's an ability to work together, and hopefully we can get legislation done on infrastructure. Locally, we also do have a homelessness problem. It is something that affects some cities more than others. Much of this is done at the city and county level. However, there are some members who are homeless who happen to be veterans. And so the federal government does have programs to help veterans. Now, one is called HUD-VASH. So it will provide the HUD part, which is housing, and then it provides services through the VASH part. So if you know of any veterans who may be homeless or on the verge of becoming homeless, please let Councilwoman Waters or I know, and we will help them. One of the first bills I got signed into law also revitalized the West LA VA, the largest VA in the nation. It also services Torrance residents. And at its full build out, that will allow the entire campus to have over 1,000 units for housing homeless veterans. We were able to get one building opened up and running a few months ago. We'll plan to get more up and running. And it is an issue that the federal government does actually have resources to help homeless veterans. And then, thank you. And then in terms of other local issues, I do want to let you know, as some of you may know, I grew up in a family business. I worked in a family business. I worked actually as a kid in a family business because we were free labor. And, but it's very clear to me how important businesses are to not just communities, but to making sure that our economy continues to grow and prosper. So thank you all for everything that you do in terms of helping the community and helping the economy thrive and prosper here in the South Bay. By the way, I have heard, so Congresswoman Waters and I have gone to other events, and I just want to confirm she's actually never said so-and-so chamber is the best in America. So that's quite a compliment to you. And then the last local issue I'm going to touch on is I will shortly be introducing legislation. I sit on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and it's pretty clear to me that diplomacy happens at a lot of different levels, not just the federal level. So we have a huge number of exchanges that happen within cities of one country and another country. We have city governments that do exchanges between one country and another country. And so what this legislation will do is provide State Department resources to local cities and counties who want to engage in this kind of outreach. And so hopefully we can get that done this term. So in terms of what's happening in the Capitol, I'm not going to be partisan here. I'm just going to be descriptive of what happened last November. So one party ran on lowering healthcare costs, on investing in infrastructure, and on cleaning up corruption in DC. The other party ran on building the wall. The American people made a decision in November, and so Democrats now control the House of Representatives, and for the first year, the House of Representatives is going to deliver on those promises that were made. So I'm just going to talk to you about some of the legislation that is going to come out the first 6 months. We're going to pass out H.R. 1, which is a bill that will reform campaign finance laws, get rid of, as much as we can, corruption in D.C., and also protect voting rights. So that'll be one of the first bills that we'll send out. We also will pass out H.R. 8, which is background checks for guns. I'm on the House Judiciary Committee. Last week, we passed this legislation out of the committee after 10 hours of debate. It was the first gun legislation in over a decade to pass out of this committee, and we intend to get it off the floor of the House by later this month. It has 97% support among the American public, including many gun owners. And what it essentially does is it closes loopholes in background checks. I call it really violent history checks. That's mostly what these background systems are checking for. So right now, if you were to go to a gun dealer and you want to buy a gun, you would submit your information, they run a background check. In 90% of the cases, it takes about a couple minutes, and then you'll get the result. But for some cases, it takes a little bit longer. Right now, there's sort of a 3-day period. So you could do that and get a gun. Or you could just go to a gun show and buy a gun. No background check, no ID check, nothing. Which makes it sort of silly, right? You have an entire system set up and then people can simply do that. There's additional other loopholes that this bill will close. It is also bipartisan. And so it is our hope that, well, first of all, it will pass the House. It's our hope that the US Senate could also pass it because it does have bipartisan support. Another piece of legislation we're going to pass out is the Equality Act. So right now in America, there are still states where you can get fired based on who you love. And what this bill will do is basically take the Civil Rights Act and put in LGBT so that you cannot be discriminated against based on your status. And we're also going to pass out legislation on reducing healthcare costs in terms of drugs. If you, so there's two things going on. One is prescription drugs, another is generic drugs. I was on the House Oversight Committee in my first term, and we were seeing these spikes in generic drugs, which makes no sense, right? There is no R&D for generic drugs. None of the arguments that pharmaceutical companies use for drug pricing would actually apply to generic drugs. So we were wondering, how come you're getting these massive spikes in generic drugs, some of which help AIDS victims, cancer victims, and other folks? So it turned out that because of the way the FDA operated, there was about a 7 to 8 year delay, backlog, whatever you want to call it, in terms of allowing another manufacturer to make the same generic drug. So some of these companies figured out they can buy a generic drug, and then they would have about 7 years where they could charge any price they want and have basically zero competition. So after we sort of figured that out, we held hearings, we went after the FDA on a bipartisan basis, and the FDA committed that they would lower that timeline to about 8 months. So hopefully we'll see generic drug prices start to drop, and it is simply one of those problems that a monopoly was inadvertently created because of what the FDA was doing. And then in terms of prescription drugs, there will be legislation coming out on that as well. We're also going to be putting out legislation on infrastructure. It's clear that the majority of American people want to see something done on infrastructure. So in addition to building roads, bridges, and highways, my view is in the 21st century, we also have to talk about cyber as part of our infrastructure. It is not good that we've had dams in the United States that have been hacked, right? That's not a good thing. So we need to protect our critical assets in terms of cybersecurity, and then we have to make sure we get rural broadband everywhere in America. So I think that will be a pretty significant piece of legislation. Because it is really big, there's lots of moving parts, that's going to take a little while longer before it comes out. And in terms of one other piece of legislation on cyber, last December, I was very pleased that one of the bills that I introduced, along with Republican Senators Hassan and Portman, was one that made sure that the cybersecurity at our Department of Homeland Security was robust and upgraded. And it did this interesting thing, which is it allowed a program to have DHS go and hire white hat hackers to hack itself, to find out its vulnerabilities. So the Pentagon started this program. It worked well, and as elected officials here know, one of the best things you can do is copy what other places have done. So we basically took that motto and said, DHS, you're going to do the same thing now. And I'm very pleased that the President signed that into law. And now I have additional legislation that does it to the State Department as well. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the national emergency that many of you are aware of, declared on Friday. So I'm just going to give you some facts. Be up to you what you want to do with these facts. So these are undisputable facts because these facts come from the Trump administration. Based on statistics from the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, border apprehensions, which is basically a proxy for how many people actually cross the border, have decreased 75% from 2000 to 2018. That's just a fact. Based on the latest data from the FBI, we know that violent crime is down across the United States. We also know that property crime is down across the United States. And then, based on data from the Department of Homeland Security, we know that in terms of illegal drugs, 80 to 90% of it goes through legal checkpoints, legal ports of entry. So those are what the facts are. And if what the president wants to do is to redirect funds to then build a wall between ports of entry, it's not clear that any of that has anything to do with the facts I just laid out, right? If you really want to stop the flow of illegal drugs, you would upgrade ports of entry. You would make sure they had the technology to scan vehicles much better. We'll give them much more drug detection dogs. We can do all sorts of things to make sure that we do more at our ports of entry to stop the flow of illegal drugs. If you also look at what the president wants to do in terms of redirecting funds, one is he would take billions from the Department of Defense drug and addiction program. Really sort of stupid, right? If your goal is to stop illegal drugs and then take from that program to take a long time to build a wall that doesn't even really apply to ports of entry. So that's just sort of on the facts. By the way, study after study also shows that immigrants, both documented and undocumented, commit less crimes than native-born Americans on a per capita basis, on a proportional basis. However you slice it, immigrants commit less crime. So those are what the facts are. And you have a lawsuit now, you're probably gonna have several lawsuits that occur. One of the great things about our judicial branch is they operate based on facts. And we feel pretty confident that we will win these lawsuits. And one reason is if you just sort of see the timing of this. If this administration thought that this was a winning strategy, they would have declared a national emergency on day one, or 6 months into it, or a year into it. They wouldn't have waited over 2 years, then additional 35 days, and then a little bit more before they did this. So we feel pretty good just based on the facts. And then I'm just going to talk to you about the law of this. So what happened was that Congress, on a bipartisan basis, right, funded government last week and specifically rejected the president's demand for $5.6 billion for a border wall. He got 1.375. If you look at the way the law is written, there is no way you can say that Congress intended to allow this statute on national emergencies to now let the president do an end run based on what Congress just did on bipartisan basis last week. So the courts would have to sort of say, well, Congress didn't intend to give him this money, but because of this other law Congress passed decades ago, wouldn't let him have that money. That is not a strong legal argument. And then the simplest way to view this is the framers, when they set up our government, they specifically set up these checks and balances, and then they gave the power of the purse to the House of Representatives. There's no way in my mind they would have allowed the president to bypass that very specific power given to the House of Representatives simply by having the president declare a national emergency. That would basically essentially usurp that entire power of appropriations of the House of Representatives. So we feel pretty strongly on that legal argument as well. But even the president can, let's say, win on that national emergency argument, on the law and on the facts. He then faces a secondary argument, which is all this lets him do is he can then access various statutes, a limited number of them, that lets him redirect money. What these statutes actually say is that if you're going to declare national emergency and then direct money from one Department of Defense project to another, it has to be done in support of the armed forces. So it's hard to say that actually it's currently not legal for the armed forces to enforce immigration laws. That's why we have an entire Customs and Border Patrol entity. And if you look at various previous emergency declarations, none of them would be to enforce using DOD money to enforce, which is essentially domestic law. So he would run into that problem as well. And then another statute says, okay, if you're going to redirect these funds, it's got to be for an authorized civil work. Well, if Congress just specifically didn't authorize all these billions of dollars for that civil work, I think it's hard for a court to find that, in fact, somehow this was an authorized work for him to then build the additional wall with that money. And then the last point I'm going to make on this is, let's say the president wins on all those arguments. At the end of the day, he will be able to do this one time. He will be able to use an additional $6 billion or so of this funding, which will get him approximately 1/10 of his $60 billion wall. And then Congress, from now on, will write in every single appropriations bill, none of this can be used for the wall, notwithstanding national emergency. So that's it. He can, even if he wins all this, he will only get this much. So that's what the administration is faced with. And by the way, lastly, the last pot of money he's going after is military construction, a bunch of which helps military families. So, you know, no one actually ever said, hey, let's go out and hurt military families until this administration came along. So that's what we're looking at. They're going to take money from military families, money from drug and addiction, to then try to build this wall. So we think we're right on the facts, right on the law. So we'll see what happens. And then let me conclude on Yemen. So one of the problems with this issue that I've worked on since 2015 is no one has any idea what Yemen is, right? So if you just walk around and said Yemen, people might go, okay, is that a candy? Is it a rock band? Like, what is it? So it's this country that borders Saudi Arabia, and there's been a raging civil war since 2015. I don't have a philosophical problem with the United States helping our allies. Saudi Arabia is an ally. What I do have a problem with is when our ally engages in what are war crimes. So in 2015, reports started coming out in various newspaper articles that the Saudi-led military coalition were doing airstrikes on civilians nowhere near military targets. When I was active duty in the Air Force, one of the things I did is I taught the law of war, also known as the law of armed conflict. I would read these articles and I would think this looks like a war crime. So I wrote a letter at that time about this then very little known war in Yemen to the Pentagon saying, hey, what's the deal with this? Why are we supporting this coalition? What's our national security interests and why are they engaging in what look like war crimes? Because our personnel are in that kill chain. We were refueling these Saudi jets at the time. In 2016, I authored legislation and then worked with other members of Congress. And the pressure that we put on the Obama administration at the time caused the administration to stop a shipment of precision-guided munitions to Saudi Arabia. By the way, this is not a partisan issue. This started under a Democratic president. It continues under a Republican president. So under the Obama administration, we put all this pressure on the administration, and they stopped this shipment. And you might wonder, well, why is it? Why would you want Saudi Arabia to have more accurate munitions? Because it turned out it wasn't that these Saudi jets were trying to hit, let's say, a moving truck and they missed and struck civilians. It turned out they were intending to strike the targets that they intended to strike. So there was this very large funeral in Yemen, all attended by civilians. These Saudi jets came in, struck it, and hundreds of people got killed or were injured. Then the jets came around again and struck the same exact location. So the Obama administration figured out, okay, these are very precise strikes on civilians. So in addition to funerals, they have struck wedding parties, civilian markets, hospitals, schools, and last year they struck a bus holding over 40 kids. And the Saudis publicly came out and said, yes, they intended to strike that bus. We were very pleased we were able to stop that one shipment. Unfortunately, the current administration has reversed. So what we did, or actually what I did last year is, after doing as much as I could through legislation, press releases, press conferences, and so on, and finally I wrote a letter to the Department of Defense Inspector General of the Pentagon. In that letter, I said this is not an action I wanted to take, but I felt like I was just out of options. And it basically asked for an investigation to see if U.S. personnel were aiding and abetting in war crimes. So this was last August, because again, we're refueling these jets that we know are striking civilians, and to me, we're part of the same chain. And under international law and the law of war, you can be guilty of aiding and abetting war crimes. So we launched that letter last August. A few months later, very pleased that the Trump administration announced they are going to stop refueling Saudi jets in Yemen. So hopefully that will stay. And then just 2 weeks ago, we passed off, actually may have been last week, we passed off the House floor the first time in many years, a war powers resolution that basically instructs the administration to completely pull out of Yemen. So that House resolution is exactly the same thing the U.S. Senate passed on a bipartisan basis last December. So it's our hope that the Senate will now take this and then pass that to the president. And at the end of the day, it's not just war crimes that are happening. It's also, you've got an unreliable ally, right? So you now have Saudi Arabia that lured a U.S. resident into one of its embassies, tortured and murdered the person, and then cut them up into little pieces, and then lied to Congress and American people for 17 days about what they did. So that has gotten members on a bipartisan basis pretty riled up. But in addition to that, you have the largest humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen. You have about half the country about to go into famine. You have people that are starving. You have people that can't get basic drugs for diabetes, for other diseases that they will die of if they don't get this medication. So it is a monumental disaster, and our country is playing a role in it, and I just think that is wrong. So we're just trying to get the U.S. to extricate itself from Yemen, and we have bipartisan support. So hopefully you know some about Yemen. If you want to learn more, you can read about it through the internet and so on, but just not a topic that a lot of people talk about. So with that, don't want to depress all of you. So I'm going to end on some happier notes, which is that our economy is doing well, and that is a good thing. And it's a good thing that we can put more people back to work. I believe, and this has been stated many times before me, that the best social welfare program is a good job. So thank you for what you all do in helping that. And thank you again for having me here, and look forward to working with all of you as we make the South Bay an even better place to live, work, and play.
This probably will come as no surprise, but we have a card and a gift for you. Congressman Lieu, thank you for making time again for some very important, albeit sobering, but critical issues that we should be aware of. Thank you.
So John said Congressman Waters and I are going to take some questions. I just want to note we worked it out, and Maxine takes the harder questions.
So we have a few minutes. We take a couple of questions. There's no wireless mic on the floor, but if you raise your hand and speak up, we'll take advantage of this fantastic opportunity. Who has a question? We have one in the back.
Yes.
Real loud.
Congressman Lieu, your children are in this Torrance school district, and I am personally concerned about the cybersecurity of children on school computers and online services. I know you were talking about cybersecurity, but specifically the laws for FERPA and COPA, which are meant to protect children, were demoted, so to speak, or eviscerated in 2011. So I would like you to please concentrate, or at least take a look at how those laws are no longer applicable to our children when they get online and have third-party providers selling our children's data. Thank you.
No, thank you. I think I'm going to ask my wife about that too. But let me make one point on that. So that's a great point you make. It's sort of related. So when I was in the California State Legislature, I also worked on a bill on cyberbullying of children. So in the past, let's say before the internet, the way people got bullied is it was sort of you and your friends and other folks, and if a bullying incident happened, some folks would know about it. The difference with the internet now is you could, let's say, take a very shameful photograph, and then 1,000 people would know about it within an hour. So the ability to sort of get a lot of people aware of something that would make a student feel really horrible has put a lot of pressure now on kids in a way that didn't exist just a few decades ago. So we'll look into those issues. Thank you.
Anyone else with a question? Yes.
Congresswoman, you mentioned about easing up loans for residential, homeless, and people who are underprivileged. What about businesses? Commercial loans as to spur more activity, economic growth. Are they going to make it a little bit more easier to get loans and more lenient and work with businesses better with the programs?
Thank you very much. As you know, the banks and financial institutions have the ability to create products and charge you what they'd like to charge you for those products. The only way to get the banks and financial institutions paying more attention to the needs of the people and creating products that make good sense and not products that basically trick people into signing on the dotted line and they not knowing what they're signing up for, is to have the members of Congress, your representatives, face to face with the CEOs of the major banks and financial institutions, where we talk to them about our desire to have fairness in the system. And of course, we have the power to deal with regulations or deregulations. And so Dodd-Frank reforms was that effort to